Hello, I'm Dr. Scott.
As disclosures,
the learning objectives for this presentation will include reviewing the metabolic dysfunction associated with disrupted sleep patterns. We'll work through and explain the physiologic impact of sleep on insulin sensitivity and resistance, identify optimal sleep patterns for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance reversal, and finally, we'll go through the information necessary to evaluate and write a sleep prescription for a person living with type 2 diabetes.
So some background, we're going to dive in just briefly for a discussion on sleep physiology that's relevant to this presentation on insulin sensitivity, but it's also just a good background for any of us in healthcare to understand some of these sleep basics. Our sleep is regulated by two synchronized processes. There's the homeostatic process and the circadian rhythm process. In the homeostatic process, we see that a sleep debt is accumulated during the day and then it's repaid at nighttime. There's some interesting research that's looked at the effect of caffeine at nighttime blocking the adenosine receptors and thereby reducing sleep duration and kind of compartmentalizing that to this homeostatic process. We also see circadian rhythms that are synchronized via light. And the research around the circadian rhythms has shown that light exposure at bedtime combined with early mornings desynchronizes the circadian rhythms. And as we'll see later, this can lead to significant challenges with insulin management and glucose metabolism. Generally, adults need about 7 to 9 hours of restorative sleep on a nightly basis. Teens that are growing need on average about 9.5 hours, and infants 16 hours. In order for the body to really enter this restorative phase, these are the hours that are necessary for recovery at nighttime. But the sleep is not just important for physiologic recovery. It also maintains mood, memory, cognition, endocrine system, and immune function. In an interesting study, they asked adults that had seen their physician about the interview regarding their sleep hygiene. And more than 60% of adults responded that they were never asked about the quality of their sleep by healthcare providers. So this is an area that's really falling through the cracks in healthcare today. We also know from sleep that it's an important time of growth hormone, cortisol, and other hormone regulations, as we'll see in just a few minutes. And importantly, sleep is a primary rebuilder of the immune system, which is critical for disease prevention and cancer prevention. So just taking a look at this basic hypnogram, it helps us to understand some of the elements of a good night's sleep. During the sleep cycle, there's a process of entering REM sleep and then the 4 stages of sleep. These 4 stages are really important, and ideally this occurs over 7 to 8 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period. The stage 3 and 4 are the elements of sleep where delta waves are produced by the brain, and it's the greatest opportunity for cellular healing. During this stage, we see that muscles receive more blood supply, blood pressure drops, body tissues are repaired, and there's new tissue growth that occurs at the cellular level. Energy levels are recharged, and the pituitary gland and human growth hormone are released. So that element, as we look at this graph, occurs really between midnight and about 3 a.m., critical hours for that restorative sleep. And as we'll see, those are also critical hours for glucose metabolism. Here's another graph that highlights the importance of those critical sleep hours between 10 and 6 a.m. This is also really important as we think about writing a sleep prescription. And so we see the coordination of these hormones, including melatonin, cortisol, and growth hormone during that nighttime sleep. And the hormonal balance is really synced up with this sleep timing. And we see that this critical restorative sleep, the stage 3-4 sleep, is synced with the growth hormone spike at nighttime, which is concurrent with cellular healing and tissue healing. We also see at the same time that prolactin is released in that same time period. Prolactin is secreted at nighttime, and it's important for metabolism, immune function, and reproduction. And we see this concurrent prolactin surge that overlaps the growth hormone and the melatonin. This is really important because prolactin helps to improve sleep architecture, is probably related to the stage 3-4 deep sleep. And we see that when we have disrupted sleep, either from sleep apnea, from work schedules, this altered sleep affects the levels of prolactin. And the research shows that critically, this prolactin disruption may be associated with carbohydrate cravings, which is really important when we're discussing obesity and the development of insulin resistance. In our modern culture, there are a number of common sleep disruptors. And in large studies where they have interviewed patients, they found that more than 70 million Americans sleep less than 6 hours per night. And they have found that this is a risk factor that's comparable to physical inactivity for the development of insulin resistance. There are lots of reasons this occurs, everything from television and screen time, social media, to our disrupted work schedules, with many people working on the third shift. Over the last 50 years, the average self-reported sleep duration has decreased by 1.5 to 2 hours. And so we see that this is a significant risk factor for declining health and should be then an element of valuable lifestyle prescription. As we age, there's a decrease in the slow waves. Again, that's the stage 3, stage 4, and an increase in non-REM sleep, stages 1 and 2. And there's a greater association with aging and spontaneous awakenings. And so we can see that that's critical to both glucose metabolism and healing.
And finally, electronic screens can be a real disruptor of sleep. They found that the electronic screen decreases melatonin production between 23 and 38%, and that when you're exposed to bright light in the evening, and especially the monochromatic blue light, that it lengthens sleep latency and reduces the delta wave activity. Now, this is very important because it's ultimately disrupting slow wave sleep and the body's ability to regenerate itself at nighttime.
So what happens when we encounter disrupted sleep architecture? Well, shift work research has given us a window of opportunity to look at some of the physiologic changes that happen to the body with disrupted sleep. They found that shift workers have higher CRP levels, develop greater levels of insulin resistance, and have higher levels of oxidative stress markers. And the disrupted light, especially during that window of sleep when our body was built to enter the deep sleep cycle, the light disrupts the suprachiasmatic nucleus and thereby disrupts circadian rhythms. We also have seen that when we have disrupted sleep architecture, that it activates the neural reward centers, and we may have an increase in susceptibility to overeating. And finally, in some large meta-analysis studies, they found that long sleep duration, but not short, is associated with increased inflammatory markers. And so sleeping beyond the 7 to 8 hours a night can also have some negative implications. As people work, and as some of us have done this as well through our training programs in medical school and residency, shifting from daytime to evening to nighttime work or overnight call, this circadian misalignment occurs. And there was an interesting study looking at 21 healthy participants who had a gradual circadian misalignment for 39 consecutive days, like many of us had during residency and our training. And they found over the course of that 39 days, there was a 32% reduction in insulin response to the standardized meal, and there was an inadequate glucose regulation. The metabolic rate was reduced, and they had desynchronized sleep. But the good news for them is that their levels returned to normal after just 9 days of recovery sleep, going back into a normal sleep pattern. But it gives us the idea that sleep disruption has fairly rapid and immediate impacts on glucose metabolism and physiology, as we see here with just the 39 days.
So sleep is important, not just
as people work, and as some of us have done this as well through our training programs in medical school and residency, shifting from daytime to evening to nighttime work or overnight call.
So sleep is important, not just physiologically, but also cognitively. The research has shown that after one night's total sleep deprivation, subjects scored lower on tests of judgment, reaction time, explicit recall, and inverse word reading. But we also see physiologically that when the sleep is interrupted, that it begins to impair the deep slow wave sleep, which is important because during slow wave sleep, the growth hormone is elevated. So when it's interrupted, we have lower growth hormone levels and a resultant greater risk of weight gain. We also see that there's reduced leptin and ghrelin levels, And these are like a teeter-totter with leptin and ghrelin on either side. And so as we enter into disrupted sleep, we see that ghrelin goes up, and with it, increased hunger and a greater susceptibility to weight gain, increased BMI, and even craving carbohydrates. We also see with interrupted sleep that there's elevated cortisol levels, epinephrine and norepinephrine levels, which can be related to carbohydrate cravings and weight gain. And finally, disrupted sleep activates the neuronal reward centers and may increase susceptibility to overeating, particularly those unhealthy foods.
So if we step back also and look at the association between sleep and glucose metabolism, we can see from some large meta-analysis studies that a sleep deprivation of 5 to 6 hours per night was associated with an increased risk of diabetes. And if we think back to that large study that found that 70 million Americans sleep less than 6 hours a night, there is a strong association for those 70 million Americans with an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. And a single night of partial sleep deprivation induces insulin resistance in people with type 1 diabetes. And we've also seen that increased insulin resistance in the adipocytes of healthy men and women are worsened with acute bouts of sleep curtailment. So skipping a night's sleep or cutting the sleep short because we have a lot of work increases the adipocyte insulin resistance, the fat cells. So it's multiple sites and multiple physiologic mechanisms. Furthermore, in some other research, it's been found that both short and long sleep are associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So short sleep is associated with beta cell dysfunction. And so that's really critical, I think, when we understand the sleep deprivation that is pervasive in our culture today, and even amongst young students and high school students, many of those that would have type 1 diabetes. And some of them still have some partial beta cell function. And so it's important for them to understand the need to get a good night's sleep. In circadian misalignment during shift work, they found a doubling of insulin resistance and inflammation with disrupted sleep. This was really interesting. For every 30 minutes of weekday sleep debt, the risk of obesity and insulin resistance at 12 months was increased by 18% for obesity and 41% for insulin resistance. And so, small amounts of sleep that accumulate over time can have an impact. And I always tell my patients that little things add up to create significant impacts, even over the course of 1 to 2 years. So when we're considering what optimal sleep patterns look like, the research really shows us that optimally it's that 7 to 8 hour window that produces the lowest risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. But as we increase our sleep out of that trough at 8 hours and start looking at 9, 10, and 11 hours, the risk also goes up almost equally for sleep deficit. And so helping our patients to understand that perfect window between 7 to 8 hours as the optimal sleep window is really important. And I often will draw this U graph on the paper on my exam table to help them understand that importance of getting a good night's sleep. So some studies that looked at the relationship between sleep disruption and type 2 diabetes. There were 5 studies that revealed an increased risk of type 2 diabetes with elevated hemoglobin A1C levels and poor glycemic control and evening preference. So these are the night owls compared to the morning preference for early risers. So there seems to be, as people stay awake later at night and miss those key windows, as we saw with the stage 3, stage 4 sleep, and the elevated growth hormone spike and prolactin spikes, as they start to miss those spikes, they have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And the research has shown that in people living with diabetes that have concurrent obstructive sleep apnea, there's a prevalence for OSA in type 2 diabetes of about 71%. And those that have both conditions tend to have more microvascular complications, such as neuropathy and retinopathy, as well as poor glycemic control. Now, in prospective interventional trials where they've utilized CPAP, they've found that improving this night's sleep through CPAP also has improved glycemic control. In my research for this presentation, I found one piece of outlying literature that is often cited, and I wanted to address it here in case you might come across this in your own research. It's a 32-year prospective study looking at women from Gothenburg that found no association between sleep and type 2 diabetes. However, looking into the methods of the study, as well as the discussion and conclusions, there are some confounders that make this more outlying compared to a lot of the other research that's available today. They did not have very good sleep objective measures as a part of this study. They did not identify objective sleep apnea or other sleep disorders. It was a single gender study, and the dietary habits were not considered. And so for those reasons, this is an outlying piece of literature. But it's important to recognize that not all the literature has found that same association between sleep disruption and poor glycemic control. However, I think there are a number of reasons why this study may not have come to that same conclusion. So let's take a look at some trials and some research where they have intervened with sleep to try and improve glycemic control and hemoglobin A1C levels.
So as we look at a few studies where they've utilized sleep interventions, we can see that in patients with obstructive sleep apnea utilizing CPAP, that 59% of the people with type 2 diabetes demonstrated improved A1C levels and better glycemic control with an improved sleep pattern. In another randomized control trial, looking at adolescents with type 1 diabetes, they found that there was an average 7.4% improvement in glucose levels with the addition of 15 minutes to 1 hour of sleep per night on average. And finally, another interventional trial, which looked to add 1 hour of sleep daily for 6 weeks, found reduced fasting insulin and improved insulin sensitivity in subjects that were able to enhance their sleep amount and sleep quality of time.
In some other studies, in an interesting study looking at healthy volunteers with 2 nights of catch-up sleep up to 10 hours per night, after 4 nights of sleeping only 4.5 hours per night, they found, again, improved insulin sensitivity and a restoration of the disposition index, which is a diabetes risk measure that's often used in these sleep studies. And finally, in another interventional trial in healthy adult volunteers with chronic sleep deprivation, they added about 1 hour of sleep every day over 40 days, so from 6 to 7 hours. And they found, again, improved insulin sensitivity in that group. In another 4-year multi-site randomized control trial utilizing intensive lifestyle intervention compared to the diabetes self-education program for people living with type 2 diabetes and obstructive sleep apnea, they found that the REM sleep improved through this intervention in the lifestyle group, but did not necessarily improve in the diabetes self-education group. And again, in the lifestyle intervention group, there were more positive changes in weight, A1C, and obstructive sleep apnea reported awakenings. They also found better weight loss, but not better sleep with improved A1C levels. And I think this study really highlights the fact that this intensive lifestyle intervention is really the key. And sleep is an element of an intensive lifestyle intervention for the optimization of glycemic control and insulin sensitivity.
Sleep is an important component of a comprehensive lifestyle medicine prescription. And when I'm assisting my patients with a sleep prescription, I typically recommend 7 to 8 hours per night based upon the available research. Now, this can be somewhat challenging for our patients because of shift work today. Many of our patients work both second and third shifts and come home to busy households with children getting ready for school and activities and things to do during the day. And so I'll work with my patients to optimize their sleep environments, including blackout shades, sleep masks, creating quiet spaces in their home to sleep, and giving themselves the space to sleep 7 or 8 hours. Because sometimes during those shift work times, patients and people feel like they have things to get done and that they can cut short on their sleep. But I try to describe to them that if they are diminishing their sleep, it has significant consequences, especially with regulation of their blood sugars. I also work with my patients to set up and keep regular schedules for bedtime and arising in the morning. And as we saw earlier in this presentation, it's optimal to go to bed between 10 and 11 and get up between 5 or 6 because of the hormonal balance that occurs during that window of time. And so often I'll work with my patients over the course of 3 to 6 months to begin shifting their schedules to an earlier bedtime and an earlier arising. And I've often found that as they have made that move, they find that they're more energetic. And in fact, my patients who are living with type 2 diabetes will have better blood sugar control as well. As we all know, caffeine should be limited, especially after lunch, and optimally, we should not consume any regular daily caffeine because it interferes with that homeostatic mechanism as we saw earlier in the presentation. I also recommend avoiding all alcohol, drugs, sugar, including sleep medications that may help put people to sleep, but they don't allow them to go into those deep restorative aspects of sleep. And then finally, other things like MSG, which can be stimulating to neurons. It's important to turn off all electronic screens for at least 1 hour before bedtime, and this includes phones, iPads, and especially the television. Exercise during the day is important, and postprandial exercise is important for people living with diabetes. However, exercising anywhere 4 hours before bedtime can be somewhat disruptive to sleep patterns because it ramps up cortisol and epinephrine. I also recommend people use their bed only for sleeping at night and not during the daytime. This helps the body kind of acclimate to sleep patterns. It's important to avoid eating before bedtime. If you eat within 3 to 4 hours of going to sleep, the body starts to ramp up the metabolic activity to process that food, and it can be disruptive to the deeper sleep and also make it more difficult to go to sleep at night. And then finally, part of a healthy sleep pattern is avoiding napping in the afternoon. And so I'll encourage my patients as they're transitioning to healthy sleep patterns that no matter how tired they are, to avoid taking a nap because that makes it more difficult to go to sleep at bedtime. And during those periods when they might feel sleepy, to do something active, go for a walk, do some housework, work outside, do something to activate their body to avoid that tendency toward an afternoon nap.
So in summary, we have reviewed some of the metabolic dysfunction. So I want to thank you for